Tonight, we open a door that has stood for centuries, carved with compass and square, sealed in silence, and yet always in plain sight. A brotherhood older than nations, born not from mystery, but from craft. They called themselves Freemasons, builders of cathedrals, shapers of symbols, keepers of a light that learned to hide within stone. From medieval guilds to Enlightenment salons, their hands shaped both temples and governments. Their oaths whispered of virtue. Their rituals mirrored the architecture of the soul. And somewhere within those lodges, beneath the hum of secrecy, the modern world began to take form. So, tonight, we trace the blueprints of power, the geometry of belief. The story begins not with symbols or oaths, but with stone. In the 12th century, Europe was rising from its long sleep. Fields once scarred by conquest turned green again. Towns clustered around monasteries. And on every horizon, towers began to climb toward the light. No one knew their names, these first masons who shaped heaven from limestone. They spoke little, worked slowly, and carried their craft like a prayer. To them, the world was geometry in motion. Each arch a lesson in balance, each vault an echo of creation itself. They were builders of cathedrals, yet what they built was more than shelter. Within every column and curve, they inscribed a secret language: harmony, proportion, the measure of man against the measure of God. Theirs was a faith written not in scripture, but in stone. In those vast churches, the ordinary became eternal. A single chisel strike might outlast the hand that made it. A carving hidden high in a nave might remain unseen by mortal eyes, yet still carved with perfection, because the work itself was the offering. These were the first Masons, and they called themselves free. Freedom, for them, was not rebellion, but mastery. A Mason who knew the rule of his craft, who could trace a circle and raise a vault by mind and hand alone, was free in the truest sense. He served no lord but skill, no creed but precision. In the guilds that formed around their labour, they guarded the formulas of their art with the same devotion others gave to relics. To build was to understand the divine order. To measure was to worship. Every line, every stone was a step toward light. In time, the craft became a passage. Apprentices learned not just to carve and fit, but to read the hidden order of the world. The square taught honesty, the compass moderation. Even the tools became emblems of virtue. To master the craft was to master the self. By the late Middle Ages, these guilds had spread from the fields of France to the high streets of England and Scotland. They travelled where work called, carrying letters of introduction marked with strange symbols, signs of trust among strangers who shared the same brotherhood. A Mason could walk from York to Canterbury and find welcome in a lodge of men he had never met, bound together by their skill, their silence, and their code. Yet even as they raised spires higher and higher, something within their craft began to change. The cathedrals were nearly done. The world they had built was beginning to question the faith that had inspired it. And so the Masons, too, began to turn inward, from the stones of churches to the architecture of meaning itself. No longer only builders of cathedrals, they became builders of ideas. The lodge, once a workshop, began to take on the stillness of a temple. The rules of geometry became rules of conduct. The square, once a tool for shaping stone, became a symbol for shaping character. The compass, once for drawing circles, now measured the boundaries of conscience. Their craft had found its metaphor. When Europe entered the Renaissance, light poured again through broken windows. The Masons watched scholars rediscover the ancients and saw in those scrolls what they had long practiced without words: the belief that order was divine, that beauty and virtue were one. As faith met reason, the builders became philosophers in aprons, blending the labour of hand and the labour of thought. In Scotland, where the guilds lingered longer, something remarkable occurred. Gentlemen, scholars, even nobles began to join the lodges, men who had never touched a chisel. They came not to build walls, but to learn the wisdom within them. They took the Masons' tools as moral emblems, their ceremonies as allegory. The craft of stone became a craft of the spirit, and so the Freemason was born, not by proclamation, but by evolution. By the 17th century, the lodges had become sanctuaries of another kind. Within their walls, rank dissolved. A noble might sit beside a craftsman, each bound by the same oath to virtue and discretion. The lodge was a republic in miniature, a space where ideas could rise freely, shaped by reason rather than lineage. The cathedral had been built. Now they turned to build society itself. In their rituals, they preserved the old forms: the compass, the square, the level, the plumb. But beneath these symbols lay a new geometry, the alignment of mind and morality. To be a Mason was not only to know the measure of a wall, but the measure of oneself. And though they no longer built in stone, the world they imagined would be just as enduring. A cathedral of principles that could stand even when cities fell. It is here, in the quiet transformation of the Mason's Lodge into a temple of enlightenment, that the modern age begins. For in teaching that truth could be constructed, not received, they laid the first foundation of the world we inhabit now. In the 17th century, Europe awoke beneath a new kind of dawn. The old certainties of faith were softening, and the bright air of inquiry filled the halls of learning. The printing press had scattered thought like seed, and wherever it fell, questions bloomed. Inside the Masonic lodges, the change was felt as both echo and calling. The Masons who once measured walls now spoke of measuring truth. They gathered not to raise cathedrals, but to build the mind. Their lodges became small worlds of order amid the turbulence outside. Each was lit by candles placed with precision, their light falling on polished wood and symbols drawn in chalk. Here, in this measured space, the chaos of nations gave way to geometry, the quarrel of creeds to the quiet rhythm of ritual. The Freemasons spoke of a great architect of the universe, a divine intelligence who worked not by miracle, but by law. In that single idea lay their bridge between science and faith. The architect did not command men to kneel. He invited them to understand. The world was his temple, and to study it was a form of worship. In this belief, the lodge became a mirror of creation. The initiate entered in darkness, symbol of ignorance, and moved slowly toward light. At each degree, he learned a virtue: temperance, fortitude, justice, the moral stones of an invisible temple. Each lesson was drawn from the tools of the craft. The level taught equality, the plumb taught integrity, the trowel taught kindness. What had once built walls now built character. Within these ceremonies, hierarchy dissolved. A prince and a printer could speak as brothers, their rank set aside at the lodge door. They addressed one another as equals, united by the labour of self-improvement. In a Europe still divided by class and confession, this simple equality was quietly revolutionary. Many of the minds that shaped the Enlightenment passed through these candlelit rooms. In England, Christopher Wren, architect of St. Paul's, wore the apron. In France, Voltaire accepted initiation in his final days. Across the Atlantic, men like Franklin and Washington gathered beneath the same symbols, believing that virtue, reason, and liberty were not separate paths, but the same road. The lodge gave them language for these ideals. The compass and square became metaphors for measured freedom. The temple under construction became the republic yet to be built. Even the Masonic phrase, "on the level," carried new meaning. A society governed not by birth, but by merit. Outside, the world still fought over dogma. Inside, men rehearsed the architecture of tolerance. They did not always succeed, but the effort itself became part of their ritual, the patient laying of moral foundations, one stone of understanding at a time. As the century turned, this private discipline began to shape public life. Masonic ideals slipped quietly into politics, into art, into the very grammar of progress. Constitutions echoed their oaths. City plans mirrored their geometry. The idea of the social contract was, in spirit, a new blueprint for the temple of mankind. Yet even in their triumph, the old paradox returned. Light, when gathered too closely, becomes power. The same secrecy that once protected them from persecution now drew suspicion. To some, the lodges were laboratories of virtue. To others, they were cabals cloaked in benevolence. The Freemasons met this mistrust with silence, as builders had always done. They believed that truth needed no defense, only patience. And so the hammer of rumor struck, but the stones held firm. Through their quiet endurance, they built something greater than the monuments of kings, a moral architecture that could not be razed. In the measured rituals of the lodge lay the blueprint for an enlightened world, one constructed not of marble or gold, but of reason, equality, and the steady labour of conscience. The Temple of Reason had no walls, no roof, no altar. It stood wherever men gathered in sincerity and discipline, seeking light without claiming to own it. Its foundation was humility, its pinnacle, understanding. And though unseen, its silhouette stretched across every capital, every library, every place where thought was free. From those hidden rooms of fellowship emerged a new vision of society, a world where morality might be built, virtue measured, and knowledge shared like light itself. The Masons had turned their craft inside out. The cathedral was now within. By the middle of the 18th century, the quiet architecture of the lodge had reached every corner of Europe. Its symbols appeared on coins and charters. Its phrases echoed in parlours and in Parliament. What began as a fellowship of craftsmen had become a network of thinkers, a fraternity of minds bound by an invisible geometry of belief. Within the lodges of Paris and London, men of influence sat beside poets and printers. They debated not how to build cathedrals, but how to build nations. The air was charged with new ideas: liberty, equality, fraternity. These were not yet battle cries, but moral propositions, spoken first beneath ceilings painted with stars. The Masonic Hall offered what the world outside could not: a space of order and civility where argument could unfold without fear. Within those walls, the noble and the commoner met on equal ground. They learned to govern themselves by reason, to decide by vote, to speak by right rather than privilege. In miniature, they rehearsed the society they longed to see beyond the door. France was ripening for transformation. In the lodges of Paris, brothers discussed the writings of Rousseau and Montesquieu. They spoke of natural rights, of the perfectibility of man, of the great architect whose plan might be reflected in just governance. Slowly, imperceptibly, the moral geometry of the lodge began to sketch the outlines of revolution. When the storm finally broke in 1789, many who stepped forward to shape the new order had once worn the apron. Lafayette, Mirabeau, the Duc d'Orléans. Each carried into the streets some fragment of the lodge's discipline. The belief that hierarchy could yield to harmony, that men could rule themselves if they first mastered their passions. Across the ocean, another experiment in liberty had already taken form. In the taverns and meeting halls of the American colonies, Masonic lodges provided a similar refuge for debate. The colonies were small, their leaders few, and the bonds forged in those gatherings proved strong. Benjamin Franklin printed the earliest Masonic constitutions. George Washington presided over a lodge by candlelight before leading an army by daylight. To them, the square and compass were not emblems of conspiracy, but of measured freedom, a reminder that a republic, like a wall, must be laid true if it is to stand. The revolutions of France and America differed in temper and in outcome, yet both bore the mark of the same invisible craft. From their rituals came the habit of equality, from their symbols the grammar of order, from their silence the courage to act. The outside world, seeing these connections, began to imagine plots where there were only principles. Pamphleteers accused the Masons of orchestrating rebellion, of toppling thrones under the guise of brotherhood. The truth was simpler and stranger. The lodge had not conspired, it had prepared. It had trained men to think in patterns of fairness and restraint, to weigh power as they weighed stone. When history called them to build anew, they already knew the tools. Yet as those tools passed into public hands, something was lost. The discipline that had made the lodge a sanctuary could not always survive the noise of politics. Passion overtook proportion. The temples of reason raised by revolution soon cracked under the weight of vengeance and fear. The same light that had promised clarity now burned with the heat of zeal. In the aftermath, the Masons withdrew once more behind their doors. They spoke again of patience, of the long work of inner building. They reminded themselves that liberty without virtue is chaos, and virtue without humility is tyranny. To rebuild the world, one must first rebuild the heart. Still, the pattern they had set could not be erased. Every constitution drafted, every parliament founded in the age that followed, carried some echo of their design, a balance of order and freedom, structure and conscience. The lodges of revolution had scattered their geometry across continents. The world would spend the next 2 centuries tracing its lines. What began in stone had passed into blood, and from blood into law. The Freemasons' temple was no longer confined to halls or rituals. It stood wherever men dared to imagine themselves, both builders and brethren, equal before the work, equal beneath the light. The 19th century opened with a strange serenity. The thunder of revolution had faded, And across Europe, the crowns that remained were learning to wear reason as an ornament. Monarchs sponsored academies. Ministers spoke of progress. Beneath the surface of empire, the quiet influence of the Freemasons continued to pulse, subtle as breath beneath stone. Their lodges multiplied in every city where trade or science took root. In the ports of the Mediterranean, in the colonies of the New World, in the halls of St. Petersburg and Vienna, small rooms glowed at evening with candlelight and the sound of measured conversation. The compass and square travelled more widely than any flag, carried by merchants, engineers, and explorers who saw in them a common language. For the Masons of this age, empire was both opportunity and dilemma. The same geometry that promised equality now found itself reflected in maps of conquest. Roads, canals, and cities were laid out in rational grids, the earth itself becoming a kind of grand design. Yet the lodges reminded their members that order without compassion is tyranny disguised as harmony. They spoke of the moral duty of progress, that to build outward, one must build inward first. In London, the Grand Lodge presided over a network that stretched from the Caribbean to Calcutta. In Paris, lodges welcomed artists and revolutionaries exiled from failed causes, keeping alive the belief that knowledge could outlast defeat. In the new republics of South America, generals and poets gathered under the same emblems to imagine nations born of liberty rather than lineage. Across all distances, the same ritual unfolded, the slow raising of a man from darkness to light, from ignorance to understanding. The brotherhood adapted easily to modernity. The printing press that had once scattered the words of philosophers now printed Masonic constitutions. Trains carried brethren to congresses where hundreds met. Strangers united by a handshake known to none outside their order. They no longer built cathedrals of stone, they built institutions, schools, hospitals, libraries, each conceived as a lodge open to all. Architects of the age borrowed freely from Masonic symbolism. Government buildings rose in neoclassical harmony, their facades whispering of balance and proportion. The very skyline of the modern world became a sermon in stone. Domes for unity, columns for virtue, light filtered through measured space. In these monuments, the ideals of the lodge were made visible, if not always understood. But with visibility came scrutiny. As nations grew more democratic and the press more curious, the secrecy of the lodges began to trouble the public imagination. Why did these men, so often at the center of power, meet behind closed doors? What did they hide behind their symbols and silence? To their critics, the Masons seemed less a fraternity of virtue than an invisible parliament of influence. To their defenders, secrecy was simply the discipline of reflection, the same stillness required of any craftsman at work. Inside the lodges, the brethren debated these suspicions. Some argued for greater openness, believing that the world was now mature enough to understand. Others held that the ritual depended upon mystery, that revelation without preparation would cheapen the experience of light. The tension between these instincts, to share and to guard, mirrored the tension of the age itself, torn between faith in progress and fear of losing its soul. By mid-century, Masonic principles had become so woven into public life that many forgot their origin. The universal rights declared in revolutions now read like lines from an old ritual book. The architecture of parliaments, the language of constitutions, the very notion of brotherhood across nations, all bore the imprint of the compass. The invisible geometry had become the shape of the modern world. And yet, for all their influence, the Masons themselves remained curiously modest. Their records rarely boast. Their minutes read like prayers written by accountants. They did not claim credit for the age they helped to build. They simply continued their work, stone by invisible stone, certain that the true builder seeks not glory, but alignment. As the century drew toward its twilight, a new challenge approached. The age of industry, of machines and masses. The old craft of individual perfection would soon confront a world built by anonymous hands. The compass that once measured the virtue of a man would now be asked to measure the conscience of a civilization. The empire of the compass had spanned continents. Its geometry was now global. But geometry alone cannot sustain meaning. The question awaited, silent and inevitable. Could the moral architecture of the lodge survive the iron and smoke of modern progress? The 19th century quickened its pace until time itself seemed to move by machine. Steam rose over the cities, blackening spires once built to catch the morning sun. Railways split the countryside into lines of iron, and factory bells marked a rhythm older measures could not follow. The world that the Freemasons had helped to imagine, ordered, reasonable, founded on human craft, was transforming into something vast and impersonal. In this new noise, the lodges tried to keep their stillness. Behind the factory walls, they built sanctuaries of wood and silence, where men could remember the dignity of deliberate work. The rituals of the craft took on new weight. The apprentice, who learned patience with the chisel, learned also to resist the haste of machines. The lodge became a place where progress was not measured in output, but in comprehension, where the light of a candle still mattered more than the flare of gas lamps outside. Across Britain, Europe, and the young Americas, the Masonic Brotherhood grew alongside the industrial world it tried to humanize. Engineers, surveyors, inventors joined its ranks, carrying the old symbols into the language of science. They saw in the compass and the level not only moral tools, but instruments of precision. A bridge could be a temple if built with honesty, a locomotive, an altar to human ingenuity. Many of the public works of the era, rail stations, libraries, museums, bore subtle traces of Masonic design. The architects who conceived them believed that proportion and beauty were not luxuries, but necessities. To raise a building that uplifted the spirit was, in its quiet way, a moral act. Their geometry was the geometry of compassion, each column and arch a lesson in balance between strength and grace. At the same time, the social world around them was fracturing. Crowded tenements, endless labour, the clamour of inequality. These were the shadows cast by the light of progress. Within the lodges, the talk turned increasingly toward charity and reform. Hospitals, orphan schools, and relief societies grew from Masonic committees. The fraternity that had once guarded the mysteries of the cathedral now found holiness in practical kindness. Some began to speak of the lodge as a model for society itself, small, disciplined, guided by principle and bound by mutual care. But outside their walls, the old suspicion persisted. Newspapers called them a secret parliament. Priests denounced them as a rival church. The Masons answered neither accusation. They continued their rituals, convinced that silence itself was a kind of truth, that ideals, to endure, must be practiced rather than proclaimed. Yet they were not immune to the currents of the age. As science advanced, the metaphors of divine architecture grew thin. The great architect became, for some, a symbol of the universal order revealed through mathematics and physics. Others held to the older spiritual language, insisting that reason without reverence would leave the human heart unsheltered. Within the same lodges that once united craftsmen and philosophers, a quiet division began. The rational against the mystical, the modern against the timeless. Still, they met. They opened their books, lit their candles, recited the ancient charges. In every corner of the industrial world, one could find that familiar scene. Men standing in a square of light, tracing the lines of a forgotten cathedral in the air. The machinery outside might shape the landscape, but within those rooms, the human measure was preserved. By the end of the century, Masonic halls had become landmarks of civic life. In towns newly risen from coal and clay, their facades offered a touch of grace. Symbols carved in lintel and cornerstone, reminders that beauty and morality once shared the same compass. They stood for something quieter than ambition, the belief that progress, to be just, must remain conscious of the soul. The world turned faster with every year, but inside the lodge, time kept its older rhythm. The tools remained on the table, polished and symbolic, waiting for hands that remembered how to use them. For amid the din of engines and the glare of electric light, the ancient craft still whispered its single lesson, that true building begins within. And so, as the century closed, the Freemasons carried their flame into the age of power. It was smaller now beside the brightness of invention, yet perhaps more necessary than ever. A steady light reminding mankind that every structure, no matter how vast, depends upon the integrity of its smallest stone. The 20th century arrived beneath banners and smoke. Nations stretched their borders like proud architects laying claim to the horizon, each convinced it carried the blueprint of destiny. Crowns glittered, armies marched, and on every continent the geometry of empire imposed its will. The Freemasons, whose compass had once traced the moral order of the Enlightenment, now found themselves scattered across a world built on ambition rather than harmony. In London, in Paris, in Cairo, lodges still met. Their members were judges, engineers, scholars, and soldiers of the far-flung realms. They spoke the same words their ancestors had whispered in medieval quarries, but the air around them had changed. Empire was not brotherhood. It divided as much as it united. The ideals of equality sounded fragile beside the roar of expansion. Yet even within those imperial networks, the quiet thread of the craft endured. Masonic halls in Bombay, Cape Town, and Sydney opened their doors to men of every origin, offering, at least in theory, the equality that politics denied. The ritual room was the one place where colour and rank might pause before the same light. In a century that spoke of civilization while practicing conquest, such small acts of inclusion mattered more than they knew. Then came war. The first great conflict shattered the illusion of progress. Fields once fertile became graves. The geometry of trenches replaced the geometry of temples. In the ruins, the Masonic idea of universal brotherhood seemed naive, even cruelly so. But after the silence returned, lodges reopened their doors. They became places of mourning and reconstruction, where veterans and widowers sat together to remember that order could still be drawn from chaos, that decency was a craft that could be rebuilt. Between the wars, the fraternity once more found itself a target. Totalitarian regimes, allergic to any form of private conscience, outlawed Masonic gatherings. Their symbols were seized, their libraries burned. Many were imprisoned or executed for the quiet sin of belonging to a brotherhood that preached freedom of thought. In those years, the square and compass became not emblems of secrecy, but of defiance, a reminder that the architecture of virtue must sometimes stand against the architects of obedience. After the Second War, the world tried again to imagine order. Nations gathered under banners of peace, institutions of cooperation replaced the hierarchies of empire. Within that fragile optimism, Freemasonry resumed its old rhythm. The lodges filled once more with veterans and teachers, with men weary of division who longed for meaning in a mechanized world. They rebuilt their temples, not of marble, but of fellowship, finding in ritual a language older than politics and gentler than creed. But doubt lingered. The age of reason had led to slaughter, the age of machines to alienation. The great architect, once the unifying symbol of faith and intellect, now seemed abstract, distant. Some Masons turned their focus inward, treating the lodge as a haven of meditation. Others turned outward, committing themselves to public service, to hospitals and schools, to the patient reconstruction of trust. The brotherhood survived not by certainty, but by humility, by accepting that the perfect temple would always remain unfinished. The new century brought another kind of trial, the glare of exposure. Where once secrecy protected contemplation, now it invited suspicion. Rumors of hidden influence and shadowed power found fertile ground in the anxious mind of the modern world. The very silence that had preserved the craft was mistaken for conspiracy. The Masons responded as they always had, not with denial, but with endurance. They understood that a symbol loses its strength when it is forced to explain itself. Through it all, the lodges kept their small rituals alive. The candles were still lit, the oaths still spoken, the hands still joined in the same ancient grip. Beneath the fluorescent lights of modernity, those gestures seemed almost archaic, yet they carried a strange solace. They reminded each generation that meaning is built, not found, that the discipline of courtesy and truth can survive any empire. As the world spun faster, through atomic light, through spaceflight, through the soft tyranny of convenience, the Masonic lesson remained unchanged. To build with integrity, to live by measure, to seek light without arrogance. They were no longer the architects of nations, but the caretakers of conscience. Their influence had receded, but their quiet labor continued. The age of empire had taught them the limits of ambition. The age of doubt had taught them the value of endurance. In both, the same moral geometry held true. A society, like a temple, stands only as long as its stones remain aligned. And alignment begins within the heart. Beneath every city, beneath the noise of traffic and commerce, there lies another map, not of streets or foundations, but of ideas. The Freemasons, who once traced their symbols on stone, had long since traced them on thought itself. Their geometry lived quietly in the design of buildings, in the phrasing of laws, in the ceremonies of nations, that no longer remembered where the gestures began. In the heart of Washington, avenues meet at deliberate angles. The monuments align like stars, their distances measured to calm the eye. In Paris, the city radiates outward from its center, as if from a single point of compass. Across Europe and the Americas, civic buildings rose with columns and domes, recalling temples of Greece and Rome, their symmetry whispering of reason and restraint. The architecture of democracy bore the unmistakable imprint of the lodge. Its lesson was simple. Beauty and balance are not luxuries, they are instruments of order. But the hidden architecture extended beyond the visible. In universities, the method of inquiry, careful, skeptical, disciplined, carried the same spirit of craftsmanship. In parliaments and courts, the rituals of debate and the language of equality echoed the Masonic meeting, where every voice was weighed on the same level. Even the quiet etiquette of civic life, the handshake, the pledge, the moment of silence before a decision, had something of the lodge about it. To the casual observer, these correspondences meant little, yet they formed the unseen grammar of modernity, a pattern of civility drawn from centuries of measured fellowship. The Freemasons had built not only cathedrals of stone, but cathedrals of behavior. Their architecture was ethical, a structure of courtesy, reason, and restraint strong enough to hold a society together through its storms. Artists felt this inheritance as well. Painters filled their canvases with light descending through ordered space. Composers shaped harmony with the same proportions that guided architecture. Writers from Goethe to Kipling borrowed the allegory of the temple and the initiate, using it to explore the mystery of human growth. Even when they mocked the brotherhood, they borrowed its metaphors. The symbolism of craft had become the vocabulary of culture. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Masons asked for no recognition. They understood that influence works best when unspoken. Their lodges remained modest, their members indistinct in public. The world they had helped to design was now self-sustaining. The geometry had become habit. Still, in quiet ways, they continued to tend it. When public discourse coarsened, they spoke again of temperance and restraint. When architecture chased novelty, they reminded young builders that proportion is a form of mercy. When faith and science quarreled, they offered the image of the great architect, a bridge between understanding and wonder. Their power was never in command, but in reminder. Critics, seeing their symbols on currency or cornerstones, imagined a hidden dominion. Yet the truth was gentler. The Masonic mark was a signature of craft, not control, an assertion that creation should bear the name of care. Their secrecy, misunderstood as manipulation, was merely discipline. The vow to speak of principles only when they could be lived. Through this modest persistence, the Freemasons became custodians of a collective memory, a memory of balance. They stood for the idea that civilization itself is a structure under constant repair, that every generation must retighten its joints, clean its windows, realign its foundations. Without that work, even the most magnificent order crumbles into noise. To walk through any great city and notice how its lines meet in quiet harmony is to sense their legacy. It is there in the measured curve of a staircase, in the way a public square opens to light, in the balance between ornament and emptiness. These are not accidents, they are reminders. The lodge may be hidden, but its architecture remains visible in the very act of living together. And if the world no longer calls these patterns Masonic, perhaps that is the final proof of their success. What was once secret has become second nature. The geometry of virtue is now woven into the daily geometry of existence, invisible, enduring, sufficient. The late 20th century arrived with both brilliance and fatigue. The world seemed brighter than ever, cities blazing with neon, television turning night into day. Yet beneath that light, many felt unmoored. The old structures of meaning, worn thin by speed and skepticism, began to crack. The Freemasons, keepers of a slower faith, found themselves standing in the glare of an age that prized revelation over reflection. Around them, everything accelerated. Industry gave way to technology. Invention replaced contemplation. The rituals of progress grew louder than the rituals of principle. The lodge, once a sanctuary of study and silence, seemed almost an anachronism. Fewer sought initiation. Fewer still had the patience to endure the long work of self-mastery. Yet those who did found in its quiet endurance a rare stillness, a rhythm untouched by fashion or fame. The brothers who gathered in those modest rooms spoke often of relevance. How could an ancient craft, shaped in stone and secrecy, survive in a world of glass and exposure? The answer, when it came, was the same as it had always been: by remaining faithful to its foundation. To be a Mason was to build, not monuments, not empires, but character. No age, however fast or cynical, could make that labour obsolete. While the world chased novelty, the lodges kept their measured order. The opening and closing of a meeting, the deliberate steps, the symbols on the table, all spoke of permanence in a century that forgot the meaning of the word. For those who entered, the ritual became a form of resistance against haste. To stand in a circle of light, to listen, to answer with care. These small acts were reminders that civilization begins in attention. Outside, revolutions of culture and consciousness redefined identity. The Freemasons did not oppose change. They studied it, weighing each new liberty against the eternal balance between freedom and responsibility. They understood that every generation must redraw the blueprint, but the measurements of honesty, kindness, and reason never vary. The moral architecture they guarded could flex without breaking. The fires of ideology that swept through the 20th century spared few institutions. Religion fractured, politics hardened, and the idea of truth itself came under siege. Yet within the lodge, a candle still burned. Its flame passed from hand to hand. The brothers learned to see their craft not as doctrine, but as discipline, a way to practice order in a disorderly world. To work on the self as carefully as one might polish a cornerstone was, in its quiet way, a form of hope. By the century's end, Freemasonry had diminished in number, but deepened in purpose. Its members no longer claimed to shape nations, only to preserve the art of conscience. Their meetings were humbler, their halls less grand, but the intention remained pure. To remind each other that dignity and kindness are not ornaments of peace, but its foundation. The modern world, in its restlessness, began to rediscover what the Masons had never forgotten. That ritual gives structure to the invisible, that ceremony restores proportion to the heart. Even the most secular of minds could sense the need for moments of pause, for gestures that reconnect action to meaning. In that rediscovery, The old fraternity found quiet relevance again. The fire of progress had burned through many illusions. What survived were the foundations that could not be replaced. The belief in measured labour, in fraternity, in the shaping of character through conscious effort. These were not relics, but roots. And when the smoke cleared, one could see that they still held firm beneath the shifting soil of history. The world had changed beyond recognition. The lodge had not. Its walls, plain and steadfast, still enclosed the same silence, the same symbols, the same promise that each generation must rebuild itself from within. The Freemasons, having endured kings, wars, and machines, now faced the subtler challenge of irrelevance and answered it by remaining necessary. The fire had passed, the foundation endured, and from that endurance came a simple truth. In an age that worships light, it is the strength of the stones that keeps the temple standing. The 21st century rose not on pillars of marble, but on pillars of light. Networks of glass and code spread across the planet, connecting minds faster than words could form. The lodge of the modern world was everywhere and nowhere, a vast, borderless chamber of voices, ideas, and restless seeking. Humanity, once bound by place, now met in the ether. In this new temple of pixels, the old fraternity faced another transformation. Its symbols still hung in quiet halls, but its conversations now traveled by message and screen. A brother in Buenos Aires could share a thought with another in Kyoto before the ink on the signature of a new initiate had dried. The craft had become global in ways its founders could never have imagined. Yet with this freedom came a challenge more delicate than any before. How to keep depth in a world of constant surface. The essence of initiation had always been the slowness of it, the measured step, the deliberate silence, the sense of something earned through patience. Online, where everything was instant, that rhythm was hard to preserve. The Masons who adapted best did so by holding to their first principle. That connection without integrity is only noise. They spoke of digital architecture, of the moral geometry that must guide even the invisible. Some lodges began to meet in virtual chambers, recreating the old ritual with care and sincerity. Candles became icons. The compass and square appeared as light on the screen, and still the oaths were taken in the same spirit. Others kept their gatherings physical, guarding the sacred pause between gesture and word. Both forms sought the same harmony, to use new tools without losing the old humility. In this era, secrecy lost its meaning. The rituals that had once been guarded by walls could be found with a few keystrokes. But revelation did not rob them of power, it merely shifted it inward. The mystery had never been in the ceremony itself, but in what it awakened. A symbol, once seen, remains inert until it is lived. The real initiation, as always, was personal, a slow construction of conscience that no screen could accelerate. The fraternity's influence was quieter now, almost invisible amid the roar of global conversation. Yet its ideals found new resonance in the chaos of information. In a world where truth was scattered, the Masonic insistence on verification and proportion felt suddenly radical. Their teachings about balance, courtesy, and the measured word became a form of digital etiquette, a way to keep the human voice from dissolving into the algorithm. Modern builders no longer shaped stone, they shaped data. Coders, architects, designers, all were Masons of another kind, tracing patterns, in the unseen. Some of them, knowingly or not, echoed the old wisdom, that structure should serve beauty, and beauty should serve good. The same geometry that once governed cathedrals now guided circuits. The same care for proportion turned code into art. For those who still met under the banner of the compass and square, the task was simple and endless: to bring conscience to connectivity, to remember that illumination is not the same as exposure, and that understanding cannot be downloaded, it must be built. They saw the digital world not as a departure from tradition, but as its continuation, another layer in the eternal construction of meaning. Even in the most modern settings, a co-working space, a glass tower, a chat between strangers in the night, one could feel the echo of the old vow, to seek light and to share it. The form had changed, but the foundation remained. The temple, once bound by walls, now existed wherever respect and curiosity met. And in that boundless, glowing architecture, the Freemasons found themselves again at the beginning. Their craft was still to build, their materials simply different. The digital temple rose from human intention, not from stone, and within its endless corridors, the same truth whispered through the static, that the builder and the building are one. Every story about the Freemasons returns, as all stories do, to the moment when a man stands before an unfinished wall. In his hand, a tool. Above him, a light. Around him, silence. The centuries fall away, and the task is always the same: to build with care. The world he builds in has changed beyond recognition. Stone has become circuitry, parchment has become code, and yet the need for structure, for meaning shaped by discipline, remains. The lodge survives because the hunger it answers has no era. Every age rediscovers it in its own language, the wish to make sense of life by arranging it into order and beauty. The modern Mason walks through cities that glitter like constellations, past towers and bridges that owe their proportions to the same geometry once traced in the dust of medieval quarries. He may not touch a chisel, but he still measures himself by invisible lines. Honesty, patience, balance, benevolence. These are the real tools of his trade, the implements of an inner architecture. Freemasonry has always been less about what is built than about how. To work well, to think clearly, to treat others with equity. These are the rituals that need no lodge to contain them. The order's survival is proof of a truth older than its symbols, that a person's life is their temple, and every choice a stone laid within it. Across time, the brotherhood's influence has spread and thinned like light through stained glass. Softer now, but still present. Its marks are everywhere, in the symmetry of a courthouse, in the patience of a teacher, in the quiet dignity of a citizen who keeps faith with reason. The age of secrecy has passed. What remains is example. The world no longer needs lodges to teach geometry. It needs them to teach proportion of the heart. To be a Mason today is to remember that building never ends. The temple is not a monument, but a process, always under repair, always expanding to hold new understanding. It welcomes doubt as mortar between its stones, for without doubt, belief collapses into certainty, and certainty leaves no space for light. The work endures because it is never complete. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the great architect. Not a distant master, but the impulse within all living things to shape, to refine, to seek coherence in the chaos. The Masons merely gave that impulse a name, and then built a language around it so that others might speak it too. The world may forget the symbols, the oaths, the titles, but the spirit behind them continues its quiet labor. It lives wherever someone chooses patience over haste, craft over convenience, truth over comfort. In that decision, the lodge opens again, unseen but unmistakable. Every generation asks what it means to be enlightened. The Freemasons have answered for centuries with the same simple creed: to build with integrity, to live by measure, to leave the world sounder than one found it. Nothing more and nothing less. The story that began in the dust of cathedrals ends here, in the pulse of a global city under the same eternal principle. The stones are different, the tools refined, but the aspiration endures. The temple rises within and without, carried forward by hands that may never meet, yet share the same purpose. The work is eternal because it is human. The light changes, the world turns, but the builder remains. He shapes what time will forget, knowing that perfection lies not in the finished wall, but in the act of laying the next stone true. And so the craft continues, quiet, steady, unseen, the geometry of the soul guiding the architecture of the world. The Freemasons built with stone, with words, with ideals. What they raised still stands, not in monuments, but in the measure of conscience they left behind. Every life aligned to goodness adds another course to that endless temple. And though its spire will never pierce the final sky, it will always point toward light. The candles burn low, their light soft and golden against the dark. The echoes of history fade into a hush, leaving only the quiet rhythm of breath. You have walked tonight through centuries of hands and hearts, through stone and symbol, through silence and song. The builders of cathedrals, the dreamers of virtue, the keepers of balance, they were only people, like us, trying to turn effort into meaning, labor into grace. Now their tools are still. The world outside your window hums faintly with its own eternal work, but here, in this moment, you may rest. The temple you build now is the simple one within, the peace of the mind settling, the steady pulse of the heart returning to measure. Let the images drift away, the arches, the compasses, the soft glow of lodges hidden in time. Let them dissolve into warmth. You have earned the rest that follows understanding. You have traced the lines, you have set the stone, and the work for tonight is done. May your sleep be deep and unbroken. May your dreams be filled with light that asks nothing of you but wonder. And when morning comes, may you wake with calm hands, steady breath, and a quiet pride in the small cathedral of your own being. Thank you for listening. May your dreams be gentle and your curiosity endless. Good night.